Morning, you guys. Will, just in time. It's time for story time with Will. Sorry about last week, but you guys know I wasn't feeling too hot, so this week we're going to start on chapter 12, and it's going to be called The Doctor. It takes place February 11th in Rawlins, Wyoming. You don't have to know who to call, even if you fix it. Jonathan Harmon, MD, flinched at the sound of his wife's voice echoing loudly across the dim, carpetless living room. He put his hand to his chest, trying to get his breath. Sorry, she added. Sorry, you guys. John smiled at her, thinking she had finally gained a little weight in the month they'd spent hiding in their home. Anne was probably half of his 240 pounds, and her hair still mostly brown instead of his salt and pepper. She was beautiful for 58. He hadn't been so lucky. You did that on purpose, he accused with a grin in his voice. Anne's brown eyes flashing concern above the fine age lines, and she set the large afghan she was knitting on the recliner's matching end table. I had to. You're so sad. John stared through the only window at a large two-story farmhouse they had covered in layers of thick plastic stalling. He took his glasses and laid them on the device that he didn't know how to repair. John frowned at the Discovery Channel special going on their muddy yard. Their neighbor's dog had collapsed and died near the barn yesterday. The collie's beautiful coat was bloody from a gunshot, and the carcass was now a carpet of swarming mutual ants. Their bloated bodies twitched in effort and obvious communication as they struggled to relocate the food. Backdropped by a view of the Rocky Mountains that was hazy from a layer of grit in the darkening sky, the foraging ants were each of the size of a quarter. They were the biggest John had ever seen around here, yet bodies constantly changing from all the contaminated carrion they were ingesting. All the nests were getting regular doses of contaminated Miracle-Gro from the chemicals, and John hated to think about what it was doing to the snakes and spiders. Once nature finished cleaning up, leaving only bones, these predators would change to other food sources, like people. And though only time would tell, John was sure their bites would be poisonous. The death toll from his man-made hell wouldn't end for the century or more. Everything had changed. It had been 38 years since he and Anne were in the Army medics at the same MASH unit, but he had to remember what had kept him alive so they could use it now. We have to pack up and go. The weather's not as bad now as almost 2 months have passed. We've cleaned out the reserves we had. John was sure he had caught her off guard with his words. He didn't know yet where they would end up, or if even they would be able to make the trip. It definitely wouldn't be a blow-off. He only knew that their hometown of Rawlins, the place they had both been born, was no longer safe, and even if it were, the temperatures were still falling. They couldn't stay here much longer, and they'd stay forever. To those open, dark ways and everything that might now be calling that nasty area home, they heard noises sometimes and were never sure if it was the moment that they would have to defend themselves. They never went down there. They also didn't take the boards he had sealed the door with, only hammered the nails in regularly. But they did occasionally tense and glance that way. John was glad Anne knew how to use both the shotgun and the rifle he kept by her chair. Not that a firearm would be very effective against sewer rats. But why should we go, Johnny? We get along here. We've seen no signs of anyone coming to save us. And because of the basement, scratch, sniff, sniff. As if to prove his point, they heard the curious, hungry rodents clearly. The sewer gates at the other end of the treeless land kept out the bigger problems, but the rat population had come in by the hundreds after the war, and he and his wife had to seal off the unused parts of their home. The rodents were big, much too wide to get under the floors, but their pups would be small enough. John expected to witness them in great numbers soon, considering they have a litter each month. Where should we go? Other than those men with the guns, we ain't seen a healthy person in nigh on 2 weeks. John forced his hand away from his aching stomach, gaze still on the yard. He wished that ugly green twilight sun would finish setting and hide the view so Ann wouldn't get so upset. Johnny? The thought of leaving their home obviously hadn't occurred to her, was terrifying, and though he felt it too, fear wasn't strong enough to get John to change his mind. She had to do things his way now. Her life depended on it. To Norred, for starters, we'll surrender to the draft, the graying Sawbones said firmly, although he was almost sure they would find little at the Colorado complex. What if it's all like here, or worse? She was referring to the dead pets, dead police, dead crops, and of course, dead friends and neighbors they had all known their whole lives. He knew the horrors were still fresh for her, especially the memory of passing the neighbor's wrecked truck on the 2-lane dirt road into the farm. Both doors were open, and they'd seen the bullet holes in the windshield as they returned from the burning office to avoid panic gripping their town, their country. Ann had wanted to stop, but there hadn't been no real reason to. The elderly couple was dead, brains blowing all over the road. We'll have to do some searching. Other healthy survivors are out there. I know it doesn't feel that way when you look out the window, but there are. We have to find them. He winced at the reference to the window. But we're old. They won't want us. Shouldn't we stay here? That, my dear Ann, is exactly what most people will do, and they will die. What the weather and disease don't take care of, the gangs and the starvation will. All these threats are lessened when humanity comes together. Despite the flaws, we are not better off, worse without society. When she leaned toward him, tan slacks rustling, John gently surrounded her with his strong arms, hoping that she wouldn't notice his racing pulse. You're a nurse. I'm a doctor. It's wrong of us to hide and deny them our help. They need us now more than ever. He kissed her wrinkled cheek. Our age will make us more valuable because of all of our experience. John now played his trump card without guilt, knowing her inability to get pregnant, which he believed to be his fault, would keep her from arguing more. Suddenly, sorry he had never talked to her about it, adopting, John ignored the pain in his gut to say, there are a lot of kids out there too, Ann. Kids who are alone and hurting. They need us. Trust me, my sweet. I do this for you. I do, Johnny. You know that. I always have. John grit his teeth against a burning wave of pain that settled deep into his guts. Good. We'll leave this week. She shuddered and opened her mouth to comfort her, but she spoke first. I never did like that damn dog. It barked too much. Ann returned to her knitting, leaving him with a shocked look on his lightly bearded face. Even after all these years, she was capable of surprising him, and he was happier than he could say that they had survived the actual war together. There was no one he would rather be with. Book 2. A while later, John was still at the window, big ants and their dinner gone, the freezing rain falling in yet another round. His mind was still on his wife, on the half-truths he told her. He never lied, but he often left things out, and this time was something huge. He would tell her soon, though. She had the right to know that the next year together would probably be their last. John sighed. He had to get her some kind of safety, and he had to do it now. He knew she would refuse to budge if she told her why they were really going. Movement in the dimness caught John's attention, mostly because there was so little of it now, and he watched a shadow limp across their driveway, keeping up the line of dying bushes around the edge of the long porch. He and Ann had seen a lot of radiation victims right after the war, mostly in the early stages where travel was still possible, and John tensed, expecting one of the walking dead. Tall and thin, with dirty curls under goggles, the young woman wore a muddy coat that came up to the top of her boots. Should he call to her? She looked healthy other than the slight limp, normal. Before John could decide, she turned toward the window. Her mouth opened in fear, panicked feet, slipping in the muddy debris, and then she was gone, disappearing into the hazy darkness. John started to go to the door anyway and had to sit back down, grimacing at another sharp lance of burning pain. He rubbed his swollen stomach, wishing the pills would hurry. He needed a lab that still had power to it so he could run some basic tests. It would be easier to plan his wife's future if he knew how long he had to live before the cancer killed him. John sighed again. He would insist something he didn't usually do. They would leave in the next few days. He wouldn't stop until he found someone to protect his sweet, gentle mate. Anne would never last in that land, new world alone. Glancing away from a mist ornament, a gaudy, grinning reindeer lying under the couch, Anne tied the last knot of the string on the blanket, then began to put away her supplies. She didn't scan her husband again, didn't need to see him to know he was in pain, and gunny sacking to keep her from finding out. He could try to distract her with talk of kids all he wanted. She did feel a bit of regret that she had never been able to bear him a son, and hadn't want to take on one that wasn't theirs. But it didn't keep her from noticing things. Something was wrong. His eating and sleeping habits had changed drastically, and she had seen the empty pill bottles in the trash. He was protecting her, like he always did, from the bad things, and while she would do what he wanted and pretended that she didn't have a clue, and knew, he was sick and hunting for a place to leave her. John wanted to be alone when he died, had said it many times. He claimed it would hurt too much to say goodbye, and while she would do anything for him, she simply couldn't allow that. Leaving him alone to die would be a betrayal of their life together, and now, after all that had happened, any betrayal of life was wrong. When they went, it would be together. Book 3, nearly a week later. Go faster, John, faster. Hold on. The horrified doctor swung the wagon into the dark woods that lined the road that killed the engine a few yards in. Glad for the heavy fog and cover of night, get down, low as you can. The elderly couple shoved themselves into a floorboard as best they could. The hurting man stifled a groan at the cramped position, glasses sliding from his face as the engine grew closer. Pop, pop. Screech! Headlights flashed their way, and they tried to get lower. The gunshots and the engines upon them as the storm rolled overhead. I love you, Johnny. Have since we was kids. A cold hand locked onto the hairy wrist through the sleeve of the plaid shirt, and John covered it with his own shaking fingers, afraid he might wet himself despite all the efforts not to. And I adore you, my sweet. The large group of cars began to fly by, and the couple froze, listening to the shots and wincing at each whine and ricochet. Drunken shouts echoed along with thuds of metal hitting, scraping. Rain thumped on the roof, a tire squealed, and a bullet pinged off their bumper, making them both jump. As their grip on each other tightened, and the couple knew the fog was all that kept them from certain painful death. Long minutes later, the gang was out of sight. their noises fading to silence. Terrified it was a trick they had been spotted, John kept them still for another 15 minutes, only moving when the bands of pain around his gut caused tears to slip from beneath his eyes against his will. Driving without lights, John took them west on 40, away from the gang. They would still go to Cheyenne Mountain. They would just take a different path. Had to. So far, they were a bit stiff and a little sore, but had agreed both felt more alert than they had in years. How long will this add? John slid his glasses into place. Couple hours. We have to get off those frontage roads, but we'll still make Route Ridge by dawn. Anne nodded, wrinkled fingers turning on the heat and defroster before digging into the bag behind the seat. Here, take these. She dropped 2 white pills into his wrinkled hand and held out an open mason jar of clear liquid. John took them gratefully. His gut was on fire, blood in his veins pounding in time with his pain. Anne flipped on the CB and went back to checking channels. He was her man, her love, and she wouldn't let him suffer. She had a good idea now what was wrong. Had been a nurse long enough to read the signs that he couldn't hide in his journey, and that it was a secret between them no more. John scanned the foggy landscape, able to see faint outlines of dude ranches and hunting lodges. Other than those and the occasional farm or dead vehicle in the road, there was almost nothing around here. It had been isolated before, now it was desolate. Wind howling through the shady darkness, they traveled steadily through the foggy drizzle for the next 4 hours. Book 4. John made good time, but when he saw the next set of bodies and cars, they were still smoking, he worried over it. This had been a group of travelers, or maybe a large family, and a gang had killed them all. The trail was indeed leading straight to NORAD. Had the gang been there too? The old man lurking inside winced as another bump jarred him against the sharp spring sticking out of the seat, and John shifted, trying to avoid it as the wagon chugged along the smoldering streets of Cranby, Colorado. He hoped Anne would stay asleep despite the rough ride, and he tried to take it easy. The gentle snoring coming from the blanket-filled passenger seat gave him hope she might sleep through this particular stretch of road. One glance at the foggy window and she would know they were in danger again. Signs of a battle littered the area, and the winners had marked their victory with devastation. Homes were in flames, even the pine trees on the front lawns were burning, their cherry Christmas lights melting onto the branches. Cars were rammed through the buildings, and lifeless bodies, even horses, lay on where they'd been shot. The blood hadn't dried yet, and the doctor was horrified to detect the tires leaving bloody tracks. But he could do nothing about it. The puddles were unavoidable. Even the windows up, the smell was revolting. Blood, shit, and charred skin. When he lowered the glass, stopping to listen for survivors, he heard only wind and crackling flames, nothing else. The equality state was no longer that. Now only the strongest would survive. And those with them, John thought, scanning his wife before sending his attention to the dangerous road in front of them. He and Anne had been that type in their youth, but now could only hope to find someone who would protect her. Pushing away the worry, John tried to concentrate on the debris-laden road, but found his eyes flicking off the horror to peer in the sky. He hated it that there was no room, no stars, just grit and thick, nasty-smelling smoke. Like a damned episode of The Twilight Zone, he complained silently, grateful that the pills were now easing the agony. John continued to survey for the signs of survivals, but the gang had been thorough, and after a long minute he drove on. Granby was a cemetery without a marker. Book 5. Dawn was starting to break as they cleared the city limits, the dusty sky barely hitting at the light, and while John knew he couldn't go another full day without sleep, they weren't stopping near here, not even for a stretch. Those men might... Want me to drive? Ann asked, making him jump. I've got my glasses. He smiled tightly as he loosened the belt over his swollen abdomen. Yes, but not yet. We'll switch after brunch, and I'll snooze in your warm spot. She smiled back as she adjusted her silk shawl tight over her sweater, then shut her eyes and lay on the pillow against the locked door. Instead of giving him hell about not telling her he was sick, she hadn't even mentioned it. Just adjusted to care for him as they traveled. She was handling the trip well. Had she too been a little bored, a little restless? Hell of a way to have an adventure, he thought. A bite to the wind said that they would be running the heater all day. John was glad to have the cans of gas on the luggage rack. 3 hours at the station with a foot pump had given him a nasty backache, but they were good for 2 weeks of driving, and he hoped to discover a safe place long before it ran out. Along with the gang they had hidden from, there had also been dangers on this trip, like the radiation victim that had snuck up on them in the fog 3 days ago and almost got the door open before John could get the wagon into drive. Talk about taking some years off my life, John thought with a touch of bitterness. The weather was almost hard to drive, but at least the acid rain would force Walking Dead to hole up somewhere and start dying. With the open sores and a lack of reasoning skills, the zombies would go to ground and not come up. The doctor inched along without lights towards the government compound, casting his eyes over the tarp in the rear of the wagon that hid their belongings, the last remnants of their life together. He desperately wanted to find a group of people like themselves, different. John knew they were out there gathering somewhere. He could feel the pull of their calls, but saw no one, and the old Ford kept on chugging. Book 6. An hour after dawn barely lit the sky, the rain and fog had both lightened, and the wagon sat on the route ridge. The older couple waited silently, but their hope was gone. The billowing smoke undeniable, their safety was in flames. Surveying the surrounding area, John watched ants taking the poison bait balls he'd thrown out the window when they first stopped. The ants were bigger, but their hill was enormous, 2 feet high and as wide as a snakeskin, and the bones of lizards scattered around it. The order of the nature had been reversed, and even here the smells of smoke, rot, and mildew lingered under the fresh scent of clean air and pine trees. Check again. Maybe we'll hear survivors. And did it slowly, but they heard nothing until the station. John put a gentle hand on his wife's wrist to keep her from changing the channel. Wait! A second later, the radio lit up in a heavy static and a man's determined words. Safe haven. Red Cross. Welcome all survivors. Follow. Clear means closer. They lost it, the radio going to full static, and John looked over Route Ridge, not needing to witness the horrors in the bunker to know they were there. Whatever you think, Johnny. Anne's voice was shaky, but there was confidence on her aged face, confidence in him. He hesitated, considered. They could at least check them out from a distance with NORAD gone. There was nowhere else John could think of if that complex had fallen, and those pillars of black smoke said it had. Then no place was safe. John headed them west. Sure, they could have heard the transmission of the new people were south. The mountains wouldn't allow the waves to carry that well on the cheap radio. He would narrow it down by the clarity of the calls, and they would determine if this so-called safe haven was aptly named. John believed leaving their home was the right thing to do. They had started seeing rats the day before, and his last memory of the home they'd shared for so long was hanging the warning rodents sign on the front door. They would probably be sick by now if they'd stayed. He had waited as long as he could. John knew the group they ended up with probably wouldn't be what he was hoping for, but if his beloved wife would be safe and have a guaranteed place after he was gone, he would offer his services in exchange. If that didn't work, he would beg. Alright guys, that is the end of the chapter. As you can see, it's going along pretty good. They found NORAD in disaster, and they have got a radio call from someplace called Safe Haven, which is where they're trying to find now. And I know it went a little long today, but it was well worth the read. And I had to make up for last week, try to catch up to where we need to be. Just so everybody knows everything, we are about 21% through the book. It is actually getting very exciting, and I can't wait to get this portion out to you guys. I want to remind each and every one of you guys, I love you guys to death. You guys are my extended family. I cannot tell you enough how much I feel about you guys. So you guys know I can't do any of this without you. And it's always as usual, God bless you. God bless me, and most of all, God bless USA. Till next time, thanks for listening, you guys.